On October 14, 1066, an exhausted English army stood on a ridge in Sussex, their shields locked together in a wall that seemed unbreakable. They were the last line of defense against a determined Norman invasion, and by sunset, the fate of England would be sealed. This is the story of the Battle of Hastings, a day of brutal, close-quarters fighting that decided a nation's future. It's a story of a battle won and lost through exhaustion, desperation, and a brilliant, ruthless deception. This is the hour-by-hour struggle for a kingdom, from the legendary shield wall to the arrow that changed history forever. The year 1066 began with a death that threw a kingdom into chaos. In January, King Edward the Confessor, England's ruler for 24 years, died without a child to succeed him. This power vacuum set the stage for one of history's most famous succession disputes. Three powerful men believed they had the right to wear the English crown. First, there was Harold Godwinson, the most powerful man in England and Edward's own brother-in-law. He was a respected nobleman and an accomplished military leader. English sources claim that on his deathbed, Edward entrusted the kingdom to Harold's protection. For the Witan, the English Council of Nobles, the choice was clear. They needed a strong English leader, and they elected Harold king. He was crowned on January 6, 1066, likely in the newly built Westminster Abbey. But across the English Channel, William, the Duke of Normandy, watched these events with fury. William was a distant cousin of Edward and insisted the throne was his. Norman storytellers painted a very different picture, claiming that years earlier, in 1051, Edward had promised William the throne. They bolstered this claim with a dramatic tale that in 1064, Harold had been shipwrecked in Normandy and forced to swear a sacred oath on holy relics, pledging to support William's claim. So when Harold took the crown, William saw it as a profound betrayal and a sacrilegious oath-breaking. He began preparing for war, gathering support, and according to his accounts, even securing a papal banner that framed his invasion as a holy crusade. And from the cold north, a third claimant watched and waited: Harald Hardrada, the fearsome king of Norway. Hardrada was a legendary Viking warrior, and his claim was based on an old, legally tenuous treaty between a previous Norwegian king and a Danish king of England. But Hardrada was an opportunist with a battle-hardened army. He found a key ally in a surprising place: Tostig Godwinson, King Harold of England's own exiled and bitter brother. With three ambitious men convinced they were the rightful king, England was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The question wasn't if an invasion would come, but from where and who would strike first. As Duke William spent the spring and summer of 1066 gathering a massive invasion force in Normandy, King Harold stood ready on England's south coast. But the winds in the English Channel refused to cooperate, blowing from the north and pinning William's fleet in its harbor for months. As summer turned to autumn, Harold faced his own crisis. His army was a militia of farmers who needed to get home for the harvest. With supplies low and no sign of the Normans, Harold made a fateful decision on September 8th. He disbanded his southern army. At that exact moment of vulnerability, the storm broke, but it came from the north. Harold Hardrada and Tostig landed their vast Viking fleet, said to be over 300 ships strong, and aimed for the great northern city of York. The northern English earls, Edwin and Morcar, scrambled their forces but were crushed at the Battle of Fulford on September 20th. The road to York was open, and a Viking conquest of the north seemed certain. When news of the disaster reached King Harold in London, his response was astonishing. In an incredible feat of leadership, he regathered his professional soldiers, the housecarls, and marched them north at a punishing pace. Covering around 200 miles in just a few days, Harold's army arrived in Yorkshire, taking the Vikings completely by surprise. On September 25th, just 5 days after the defeat at Fulford, Harold unleashed his attack at Stamford Bridge. The Vikings were caught unprepared, many without their armor, still celebrating their victory. The battle was savage, but Harold's tactical brilliance won the day. Harold Hardrada was killed, along with Harold's treacherous brother, Tostig. The Viking invasion was shattered in a stunning, decisive victory, but it came at a terrible cost. Harold's best troops were now hundreds of miles from the south coast, battered, wounded, and exhausted. Harold and his men were still recovering from their bloody victory when a messenger arrived, breathless, with the worst possible news. The winds in the Channel had finally changed. Just 3 days after Harold's triumph, on September 28th, William of Normandy's invasion fleet had landed, completely unopposed, at Pevensey on the south coast. The Normans wasted no time. They set up a base, building a prefabricated wooden castle, and began to raid the surrounding countryside, which happened to be Harold's own personal lands. It was a deliberate provocation designed to force Harold's hand. Harold faced an impossible choice. His army was exhausted from the forced march north and the brutal fight at Stamford Bridge. The logical move was to wait in London, rest his men, and summon fresh troops from across the kingdom. But William was pillaging his lands, and as king, Harold felt immense pressure to act. He couldn't afford to look weak. Driven by a mix of duty, pride, and urgency, Harold made his decision. He would not wait. He led his weary army on another grueling forced march, this time over 240 miles back down the length of England. He gathered what men he could along the way, but it was a gamble born of desperation. The fate of his kingdom would now rest on the tired shoulders of an army that had just fought one major war and was about to fight another. By the evening of October 13th, Harold's army had arrived. He chose his ground carefully, positioning his troops atop a ridge known as Senlac Hill, about 7 miles from Hastings. It was a powerful defensive position. The high ground gave him a clear advantage, with steep and marshy slopes that would tire and disorder any attacker. Harold's plan was brutally simple: form the legendary Anglo-Saxon shield wall and dare the Normans to break it. The two armies that would face off at dawn were a study in contrasts. Historians estimate Harold's English army was composed of between 7,000 and 8,000 infantry. At its core were his elite housecarls, professional soldiers in heavy mail, wielding shields and the fearsome Danish great axe, a two-handed weapon that could slice through a knight and his horse. Backing them up was the Fyrd, a militia of part-time soldiers, many with little more than spears. Critically, the English had very few archers and no cavalry. Their strategy depended entirely on holding a solid, defensive line. William's Norman army, estimated at 7,000 to 12,000 men, was a modern combined arms force. It was split into 3 divisions: Bretons, Normans, and French soldiers. Unlike the English, William had a large contingent of archers and, most importantly, around 2,000 heavily armored knights on horseback, the shock troops of the medieval world. William's plan was aggressive: use archers to weaken the English, send in infantry to engage them, and then deliver the shattering blow with his knights. As the sun set, the two armies made camp. The English, weary from their epic march, tried to rest. The Normans, fresh and confident, prepared for the assault. The stage was set for a clash of kings, armies, and cultures. The morning of October 14th, 1066, broke clear and bright. As the Normans began their advance, the English stood ready, shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping in a near impenetrable barrier. For hours, this shield wall would prove to be unbreakable. The battle began around 9 a.m. with the terrible sound of trumpets. William opened with his classic strategy, ordering his archers to fire on the English line. But it was useless. The English were on higher ground, and the arrows either flew over their heads or thudded harmlessly into the wall of shields. Frustrated, William sent his infantry up the slippery slope. They were met with a hail of javelins, stones, and axes hurled down by the defenders. When they finally crashed against the English line, they were brutally repulsed. The great axes of Harold's housecarls swung with terrifying force, hacking through helmets and mail. The Norman infantry was thrown back in disarray. Now it was time for William's trump card, the cavalry. He ordered his knights to charge. Lances ready, they thundered up the hill, intending to smash through the English line. But again, the shield wall held. The horses struggled on the incline, and the wall of spear points was impassable. The charge failed completely. For hours, the battle raged in this pattern. Each time William threw his forces at the English line, they were thrown back. On the Norman left, the Breton division crumbled and began to retreat in a panic. Seeing this, some of the English militia broke formation against orders and charged down the hill in pursuit. It was a disastrous, fatal mistake. The unauthorized English charge created chaos. As the undisciplined Fyrd chased the fleeing Bretons, a rumor tore through the Norman lines. William was dead. Panic set in. Seeing his army on the brink of collapse, William took off his helmet, riding through the ranks and shouting that he was alive and they would win. His leadership rallied his men, and in this moment of crisis, the Normans turned the English mistake into an opportunity. William ordered his cavalry to wheel around and attack the pursuing English, who were now exposed on the flat ground. Cut off from the safety of the shield wall, they were surrounded and slaughtered. Whether it was a brilliant improvisation or the plan all along, William had found the key to victory. He had discovered the one weakness in Harold's army, their own eagerness. He decided to turn this accident into a deliberate, ruthless tactic, the feigned retreat. It was a dangerous maneuver that required immense discipline, as a fake retreat could easily turn into a real one. Throughout the long afternoon, Norman knights would charge the shield wall, clash briefly, then pretend to flee in panic. Goaded by the sight of another retreat, more groups of English soldiers would break ranks and give chase, and each time, the Norman cavalry would turn on their pursuers, cutting them down in the open. Historians still debate how planned this was, but it was brutally effective. It didn't break the shield wall in one go, but it slowly bled it dry. With every feigned retreat, the English line grew thinner and more ragged as their best warriors were drawn out and killed. The wall was still holding, but it was being chipped away, piece by piece, as the sun began to set. As the day wore on, the scene on Senlac Hill was one of grim attrition. The English shield wall, though depleted, still held the ridge. The ground below was littered with the dead. Harold Godwinson was still alive, fighting on foot with his men, and as long as the king stood, the army stood. William knew he was running out of time. With dusk approaching, he needed to break the English before nightfall. He commanded his army for one last, massive assault, but with a deadly twist. He ordered his archers to change their aim. Instead of firing at the shields, he told them to fire high, arcing their shots so the arrows would plunge down on the less armored men packed behind the wall. While this is a popular theory, and not explicitly documented, the effect was devastating. The arrow storm caused chaos and horrific casualties. It was in this hail of arrows that the decisive blow of the battle is said to have fallen. King Harold was struck down. The famous Bayeux tapestry shows a figure with an arrow in his eye. Beneath the inscription, "Here King Harold has been killed." However, some early accounts suggest he was hacked down by Norman knights who finally broke through the line. It's possible both are true, that he was wounded by an arrow, then killed by knights who overwhelmed him. We will likely never know for sure, but the result was the same. The King of England was dead. The news shattered the morale of the English army. In a final, legendary act of loyalty, Harold's remaining housecarls formed a ring around their fallen king's body and fought to the last man. But the battle was over. The shield wall finally collapsed, and the remaining English forces broke and fled into the twilight, cut down by the triumphant Norman cavalry. With Harold dead and his army scattered, the Battle of Hastings was over, but the conquest of England had just begun. William rested his army, then began a slow, looping march toward London, securing key towns and terrorizing the countryside to crush any remaining will to fight. In London, the surviving English nobles panicked. They hastily proclaimed Edward the Confessor's young great-nephew, Edgar Atheling, as king, but the teenager had no real power. The northern earls, Edwin and Morcar, who had failed to support Harold at Hastings, offered no resistance. One by one, the English leaders rode out and submitted to the invader. On Christmas Day, 1066, less than 3 months after the battle, William, Duke of Normandy, was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, the same church where Harold's coronation had taken place at the start of that fateful year. His victory was complete. He would be known forever as William the Conqueror. The Battle of Hastings wasn't just a Norman victory. It was a turning point that ended 500 years of Anglo-Saxon history and ushered in a new Norman era. The consequences were profound and permanent. In the years that followed, William brutally suppressed English rebellions, culminating in the harrying of the North, a scorched earth campaign that devastated vast swaths of the country. The Anglo-Saxon ruling class was almost completely replaced. William seized their lands and granted them to his loyal Norman barons, dramatically reshaping England's system of land ownership and centralizing power in the hands of the king. A massive castle-building program began, with icons like the Tower of London rising as symbols of Norman power. The language of the court became Norman French, and for centuries, English vanished as the language of government. When it re-emerged, it was a profoundly different language, enriched with thousands of French words. England's cultural and political ties to Scandinavia were severed, and the nation was reoriented towards continental Europe, setting the stage for centuries of conflict and connection with France. The modern English nation was forged in the fire of that one bloody day. The Battle of Hastings didn't just decide who would wear the crown. It reshaped England's language, culture, and society forever. All of it decided on a single hill, on a single October day.